Yep. Okay. Great. Okay. So welcome again. This is part of our week-long event of the Contested Cities Network. I think we all know each other more or less, so we all know what Contested Cities is anyway. So I won't really repeat that. But today we've got Neil Turnbull talking about commercial gentrification. This is one of our, if you want, themes of the network Contested Cities that we're developing with people interested in this theme across some different cities in Europe and Latin America. And Neil has been working on this topic for a while as well, but sort of just been coming together with the Contested Cities network as well. So Neil is an architect from, you were trained in Edinburgh, right? And then moved to Chile for a while. So he's been working there in the Faculty of Architecture and Planning in the University of Chile. And he's kind of coming back now to the UK. And in the meantime, he's been visiting us here in Leeds. So yeah, so you're coming from an architectural background, but you're getting interested into socio-economic processes and planning. So we're going to hear about his research in a neighborhood in Santiago, Chile. I think that's it. I think that's just leaving to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you and good afternoon. Thank you for coming along. Thank you also to Sarah Gonzalez for inviting me to give this talk. Tonight's talk is based on work that I have been developing with my colleague Elke Slack. So here Elke is present in the content of this talk, even if she's not present in person. The title, Commercial Gentrification in Inner City Santiago, the case of Caupolicán. This is, I'll explain later exactly what we're going to look at, but this work is also part of a book chapter that we published recently in the Global Gentrification's Uneven Development and Displacement, published by Policy Press in Bristol, and it's been edited by Loretta Lees, Ernesto Lopez, and Yun Shin. So I'll be sharing that work with you today as well. In terms of the the structure of the talk this evening, I'm going to explain briefly a small introduction to the gentrification debate in Chile. I'll introduce you to some of the renovation strategies of the inner city, and we'll have a look at one of the neighbourhoods, our case study, which is Italia Caupolicán, and we'll explore gentrification in this area, and we'll finish with some conclusions. Gentrification debate in Chile. There are some aspects present in the literature on gentrification in Chile, which are to do with social upgrading. There is also a body of work which is to do with the planned decline of neighbourhoods as a pattern of class appropriation of land, which leads to the displacement of lower incomes. And this is work that we can see in our colleagues from Contested Cities and the work of Ernesto Lopez and Janoschka. Where are these places, these gentrifications taking place? Where are their physical locations? Well, we have gentrification on the periphery in Santiago and new build gated communities and condominiums. And we also have gentrification in the inner city, where we have new build gentrification. And there is also some research on the renovation of historic patrimonial areas. In Chile, the discourse on residential gentrification is very strong, whereas there's been less attention paid to commercial gentrification. Here is a photograph of an example of the new build urban renewal in Santiago. So this is obviously when I show this next slide and explain exactly what's going on, you can see that, can't we? But this is the towering high-rise blocks, which is to do with getting profit out of the land through large building volumes. And so this is has a very physical presence with the the 1- and 2-story existing buildings, and this also causes displacement. Where does this come from? There's been quite a lot of work about the origins of this, products of state-led entrepreneurialism producing the gentrified landscapes, which Lopez has discussed. The mechanisms for this gentrification, we have a state subsidy for inner city urban renewal, which is basically the state paying private developers money for each individual housing unit they are building in the city centre. And there's also a deregulation of planning law, which basically allows for these enormous buildings in very low-rise locations. In terms of the inner city, in terms of the places of heritage value, we have a slightly different story. We've got the rehabilitation of existing historic structures. We've got the presence of students and restaurant goers. These are the indicators, if you like, of gentrification. But often these indicators do not provide enough evidence or are not considered to be processes of gentrification, as these gentry don't actually live in these areas, and they go home at the end of the day. So they only experience them as tourists. There's very little evidence of gentrification in the inner city involving the renovation of the existing urban fabric. Although we can see that in these heritage locations, there are a number of places where processes of urban renewal are actually taking place. So I've got some photographs here of different neighbourhoods in Santiago, Brasil Yungay, La Staria, Bellavista, and Italia Caupolicán. These are characterised by their bars and restaurants and their nighttime economy, with the exception of Italia Caupolicán, which is an area which is more characterised by the design shops and the boutiques. To take a look at the origins of these processes, in Brasil and Yungay and La Staria, this is the renovation of these neighbourhoods are products of state-led urban renewal. In the case of Brasil and Yungay, they have new cultural infrastructure such as libraries, museums, and arts centres. And in the case of La Staria, they have new investment in transport infrastructure, where they have metro and they have new underground parking. And this contrasts with the other two neighbourhoods, which are Bellavista and Italia Caupolicán, which are more piecemeal in the way that they're developed. So individual properties are slowly developed, are slowly renovated, where we have small-scale private investors. And in terms of gentrification, this is very similar to this classic first wave gentrification examples from the global north. So moving on to the case study of Italia Caupolicán. What do we have here? We have a different urban environment. We have high-end commercial moving into what is a working lower middle class neighbourhood. We have a conflict between the existing population and the new population who come in to set up retail and have a different view of what the neighbourhood should be for. So we ask, is it gentrification, and is it commercial gentrification? What kinds of processes are going on in the neighbourhood? In order to address these questions, we're taking part of the broad definition of gentrification, which has been developed by Davidson and Leeds in their work in London, and we're taking three of the aspects of this gentrification. We'll be looking today at the reinvestment in the neighbourhood, identifying the ways in which land is exploited, the ways in which profit is made in the neighbourhood. We'll look at the landscape change, looking at how this reinvestment is taking place. And finally, we'll look at displacement and outlining possible approaches to displacement with commercial gentrification. So, to start, the reinvestment of capital. From the 1990s, we have evidence of growing interest in this area, reinvestment in the area, and this has taken place through the rehabilitation of existing buildings. The planning permissions from 1999 to 2011 show there is the vast majority of regeneration, renovation is related to extensions and alterations. This drawing shows the ways in which profit can be made from large building volumes in different parts of the city. The first drawing, to your left, shows the actual renovation going on in the neighbourhood. And what we've done here is we've calculated the floor area ratio, which is basically an indicator of the size of the building, and we've given the maximum height of the buildings. So this is quite a modest development. We've compared this to what's possible under the planning regulations in this neighbourhood. So that's number 2. So at number 2 we have what is possible to build in this neighbourhood under the planning permissions. And so what we have is we have floor area ratio of 2.7, a maximum height of 5 stories. So you could almost, to a certain extent, double the amount of building volume in that area. Now, this doesn't seem to be happening. What seems to be happening is number 1, is the renovation just of the buildings themselves. When we compare this to other neighbourhoods and the planning regulations of different other neighbourhoods in Santiago, we can see that this is a very modest kind of opportunity for the development of the neighbourhood when you consider that this is a regulation from the very first picture we saw with the very high-rise buildings. Yeah, this is what you could do if you apply those planning legislation to this area. So what we have here is we have a floor area ratio of 28 and a maximum height of 48 stories. So here the restrictions on the size of the buildings is very key and very important in the ways in which profit can be extracted from land. I'll take questions at the end if you want that to be explained again. So what I'm trying to say here, or what I'm saying here, is that the search for profit isn't, you're not able to get that through having large building volumes in this neighbourhood. It's not possible. So what is possible? The regulations also regulate the land use in the neighbourhood. And the land use in the neighbourhood, in this neighbourhood is quite permissive. So what can happen is that you can have a dwelling, a residential unit that can be very easily turned into a retail unit without having a lot of paperwork, without a lot of bureaucracy. This is something that can happen very easily. And so this is an interesting thing to think about how the profit can be made in these areas. And we have Ingram talking about the switch from residential use to commercial use, and how in areas with high land values, he says, the residential uses are only financially justifiable if they're high density, whereas commercial use is capable of capturing the necessary profit to justify the investment. So we can't build high-rise buildings, residential buildings in this neighbourhood. This is not permitted under the planning legislation, but we can turn the buildings to commercial use. And so this is a way in which we can decide, we can imagine that commercial properties in this neighbourhood are becoming more lucrative. What we did is we studied and analysed the difference in the variation in terms of the profitability of commercial use in this neighbourhood compared to the whole of the municipality. So what we're trying to do here is trying to find out if there is, and these are for rented units. So what we have for renting in this neighbourhood, renting commercial properties, we have a 5.8% increase in the value of rented property between 1990 and 2013. So these were taken from the newspaper and from advertisements for renting properties within the neighbourhood and within the municipality as a whole. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to show the difference in the profitability of commercial units in this area. So the variation over these 13 years is 5.8%, whereas in Providencia as a whole it's only 0.7%. So it seems to be that this area, in terms of renting out commercial properties, is becoming much more profitable than other areas within the same within the same municipality. But we should also say that this isn't this opportunity to change from commercial from residential, to commercial, is also apparent in different in other neighbourhoods. What I'm showing here is the ways in which that profitability can be changed from being small scale to large scale. And this is taken from the work of Sharon Zukin from 2009 and her work on boutiques in New York City. She classifies the stores within the neighbourhoods to try and understand what kind of what level of economic economic profitability these places are in. So what I want to say is the local shops, they're individually owned. These are for locals. And we've managed to identify where these are. We've identified the new entrepreneurial boutiques. These are come in two different classifications. They're individual properties used by owners for retail, and they're also shopkeepers who rent and make their business selling design products. And these are orientated towards wealthy tourists from the city, from other parts of the city, and tourists from abroad. Zukin has another categorization, which is corporate shops, which is to do with the chain stores and how the chain stores begin to capitalize on this landscape of boutiques. There's no evidence of this yet in the neighbourhood yet. So, as I was saying earlier, this is the idea that changing from residential to commercial is a lucrative way to go about exploiting land. Also, we're asking, is this enough? Is it just enough to have that opportunity? Because there are other places in Santiago that have similar morphology and a similar opportunity to change from residential to retail. And so we begin to think about things which are local characteristics of the neighbourhood, which add to that profitability and add perhaps to the opportunity to make money out of this area. And so we refer again to the work of Zukin and to André Holm, a German geographer who's worked in gentrification. And we look at things such as the artists within the neighbourhood, or the furniture restorers, and the existence of cultural capital here that make this place into a distinctive place, that give this place an edge over other places which maybe do not have the same characteristics. Paul talks about this process where the individual cultural capital of these individuals, of these people, is transferred to the physical environment, and then it becomes systematically exploited as a distinctive place. So these are people who come into a neighbourhood, who give value to the neighbourhoods, which in turn are exploited by others in the search for making a new distinctive place. So what does this look like? What kinds of things are happening in the landscape? And how does this process of the exploitation of the individual cultural capital manifest itself in the landscape? So how can we begin to think about how this takes form within the neighbourhood? And so, again, with Sukin and Home, we look at the stages of the commodification of this cultural capital. This is a progress, this is a process that begins with these individuals, with their cultural capital, which then is transformed into real cultural capital, which is the idea of embedding this capital, which could be, in the case of architects, to talk about the talk of the reinvestment in the built environment. And then the type of promotion that these actors who are involved in this embedding of this cultural capital, how they promote the neighbourhood and to a certain extent push further forward this idea of this being a special or distinctive place. Now, to give you some examples of what's happening in the neighbourhood, this is a photograph of the roofs of some of the buildings, and we have a small wind vane, a small wind vane on the top of an artist's studio. From the 1980s onwards, we've got the incoming of artists into the area. They're beginning to colonise the area, they're beginning to inhabit the area, they're beginning to be on the street, they're beginning to give change the way in which the neighbourhood is used. Also, from the 1980s, we also have a group of furniture restorers who begin to inhabit the street to carry out their profession, which is to do with the restoration of furniture. And these people also begin to have a certain, give the place a certain distinction. This, in turn, is translated, or you can imagine this becoming embedded into the environment and turned into real cultural capital. From the 1990s onwards, we have the beginnings of commercial artist studios coming to the neighbourhood to set up. So they are attracted by the artists and also the furniture restorers, and they come into the neighbourhood and they start to be associated with these artists and furniture restorers, and they begin to start to install themselves and make money. Also, there's a case of an upgrade in the public space. This is a street which has been specially designed for the furniture restorers, so they can work outside and they can work on the street and they can sell their furniture. And also we have a roof that's been placed over to give protection to the people from the rain and sun, so they can walk along and to assist this idea of this place of production of furniture and restoration of furniture. And finally, sort of the next stage is how some of these actors or people involved in the neighbourhood can begin to promote the neighbourhood. So what we have here is Barrio Italia, which is the way that in which the new shopkeepers are organising themselves and branding the neighbourhood. So they've got together and they've decided they want to make a website for the neighbourhood, and they've decided to promote the neighbourhood by having certain routes that go through the neighbourhood. There's a gastronomic route, there's a heritage route, there's a route to design shops, and there's also, which obviously they're all part of, so they're benefiting from this. And they've rebranded the neighbourhood by Italia. And so this is a way in which the special place becomes promoted in different ways. And what happens round about the areas, the buildings of the new high-rise buildings which are close to the neighbourhood but not within the neighbourhood are being built, and they're being called after the neighbourhood, and so they were called Italia Tower, for example. So this is ways in which the special nature of the place is being used by others in terms of the change of landscape. So this distinctive place in terms of its characteristics, the ambience of the area is constructed or made by the traditional building typology, the patios, the continuous facade. So when we talk about the renovation of the building, the renovation of the building, it's not just about obviously the building volume or the floor space, but also about the special characteristics that the buildings have, the historic characteristics that they have. And these heritage features, such as old timber finishes or exposed brickwork or adobe, is all part of this difference. These are things that you might find in other areas to be quite common, but in terms of Santiago, this was a very new and very different way in which profit was made from areas. So to mention that is very important to understand the context that basically what we saw at the beginning, knock everything down and build huge high-rise buildings, is the way that Chileans were thinking, or at least that was the way that in which urban renovation was happening in many parts of Santiago, and still does happen in Santiago. And also the distinctive place we can see in the shop signs. So this is sort of symbolically expressed in the local shop signs, which you can see in terms of how they relate to the landscape. And so this is a photograph of a greengrocer that has been in the neighbourhood for the last 50 years. It doesn't have a sign, it doesn't need a sign, the people know where it is, they know the woman that works there. So this is somewhere that is notable in terms of its sign by its lack of sign. We have another a mini market, which is on the corner, and this doesn't have well, this has a name, but it's the name of the woman that serves in the mini market. So when you go in there and buy your bread, Zurita is the one who's going to serve you. Mm-hmm. So there's also a very direct relationship with the name and with the place. Now this becomes more apparent when we begin to look at the shop signs of the new commercial premises, which are all to do with trying to advertise their presence, trying to cash in on the idea of this this place of being a place of distinction, but they do it in such a way as to use sophisticated foreign names or sophisticated typology or sophisticated signs themselves. So they're already talking about a different kind of place. Some of them use English, for example, in popular design, and some of them try something a bit different and go for something which is funny, or it's the idea that that these places are have to attract people into them because they're part of this the independent floating population of tourists for their business. So, what does this mean? What impact is this having on the local population? In terms of commercial gentrification, it's interesting to link this with the landscape change. Hukin talks about the sense of place, and in the case of New York, there's a apparent loss of local shops. There's an increase in the visibility of the new boutiques, and which is something that's beginning to disrupt local social life and may alienate long-term residents. She talks about considering the displacement of the potential customer that's forced to buy a more expensive and a more sophisticated product in this neighbourhood, the gentrified neighbourhood offers. And she ties us into the right to shop. She calls this a right to shop, as the right to the city debate, and the ability for people to be able to go within their own neighbourhood and buy what they need is being diminished. obviously relates into the work for Marcuse and the indirect displacement or the pressure of displacement caused by a loss of social networks and facilities which conspire to undermine the quality of life. We have some examples of with interviews with people, and we have a shop owner here saying, I feel happy with my display of fruit and vegetables, and I feel happy with my neighbours that come along to buy something and gossip. So I don't want to change either my clients or my products. In this context, with rising the possibility that there's a rise in rent, and how then can people, how can clients or how can shop owners keep up with that rise if they're unable to change the products. In terms of residential displacement within this neighbourhood, we talked about this change from residential to retail. I'll start by saying that we don't have information. This is a slide that shows information from 1982 to 2002. It's not recent enough to give us very useful information. It can show us, however, some ideas about some of the processes and the ways in which things are going. I'll explain that the Chilean 2012 census data is not available. It was withdrawn after allegations of incorrect handling of information, and they're waiting to retake the census next year. So the data here is very out of date, but what the data does show is it shows a massive drop in the population. The population is more than halved between 1982 and 2002. And we compare this with the local municipality in the metropolitan area, which is an increase in population. And also, we can see that there is the growth of professional inhabitants in this area, which we might think or might be able to construe as gentry in these neighbourhoods. Again, it's very difficult to have very definitive conclusions about this information until we see the more recent information. Thinking again about some indicators of the idea of displacement, we began to have a look, we've had looked at the issuing of new commercial licenses in the neighbourhoods, and we found evidence. This is a long historical survey that goes back to the 1940s. But within this, we began to notice a certain pattern in terms of the issuing of new commercial licenses, which basically means the appearance of new commercial retail in this neighbourhood. So from the 1940s, we have a great number of services. You can see it's the neighbourhood is one small part of the neighbourhood which is well populated by retail use. In the end of the 1950s, we still have a fair amount. We begin to see certain land uses coming in, which we might be able to associate with a decline in the neighbourhood, and these include furniture manufacture, car mechanics, warehouses, textile factories. And then in the 1990s, we have a period where there is very little change. There's very little new retail, so there's very little new retail. We have basically here, we have mechanics or warehouses, and we have the beginnings of some of the furniture restoration which we saw from the beginning. And finally, the period from 2009 to 2011, we have again a rise in the issuing of new commercial licenses in this neighbourhood. So there seems to be an explosion of interest in retail in this neighbourhood, and these uses are a jewellery workshop, we have antiques shops, we have coffee shops, we have design stores, and we have cafes. So what can we tell from this? We studied the commercial licenses for each of the individual retail units, and we were able to, which amounted to a number of 48 properties was the total. 92% of the new commercial licenses are in properties which were not previously registered as commercial in 2009 and 2011. So this perhaps means that before they were residential properties. It's very difficult to be very certain about this, because we're basically making all this data from municipal records, which are not always the most complete. So these are indicators rather than evidence. So quantitative evidence. And finally, the 90% of the new commercial units are in surviving examples of domestic architecture. So what we did a survey of all of the new commercial units, and we were able to see which ones were within domestic architecture. Domestic architecture from 1900 to 1930. So we begin to see, in this case, we began to see a pattern. So it seems to be that the developers are looking for houses that have a certain kind of aesthetic that come from 1900 to 1930, and this is where they're looking for their opportunity to come into the neighbourhood and be part of this, and to become part of this distinctive neighbourhood. So that's interesting as well to think about things which have to do with resisting gentrification. The other buildings, the newer buildings, the newer houses, are perhaps aesthetically not part of the aesthetic, or the predominant aesthetic, were being sort of ignored or left behind. So, some conclusions. Gentrification, we'd say here, to repeat, is an opportunistic exploitation of key neighbourhood factors, which are transformed into capital gain, leaving local communities vulnerable. We call this emerging. It's not yet reached completion. We don't think the corporate interests that are apparent in other places of gentrification are yet in the neighbourhood. And the question is, will they or won't they? And perhaps this stage of gentrification might not come about in this context. So some of the questions that we ask ourselves: how do we defend heritage areas from the pressure of competitive retail clusters? How do we avoid culturally distinctive places being exploited for financial gain at the expense of the local community? And then finally, what are the opportunities to challenge this process? And here, I'd ask, as an architect and as a planner, questions which are very much related to do with ways of restricting growth, perhaps of the commerce, which imposes an inappropriate lifestyle on the local population, or a lifestyle that is inappropriate. How actually would we be able to define that and to agree with certain people on which ways the retail should, and for who the retail should be? Perhaps a better question would be, what are the arrangements of space that promote accessible shopping? How can they be promoted and maintained? And this question links very much into the work that we're now involved in terms of the work on markets and traditional markets and contested cities. So we're looking at spaces that do offer accessible shopping, that do offer shopping for everybody, and we're looking at ways in which we can understand those processes and the characteristics of those places, so that we can begin to try to understand how the city might be designed in a certain way which is related to the common good rather than to profit. Thank you for your attention. Just one last thing: if this article is in this book, it gives more information. If you have any questions, speak to me then. here are both our emails, both mine and Nikki's. Thank you very much.
Okay. Questions? Yeah. Answer. Paul, answer.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That was fascinating and very fine-grained analysis, which I think is often missing from gentrification studies. So that is really interesting. I was wondering about the land ownership, because you talked about renting. So it seems that, but what I understood was that some of these retail stores are being rented out, and so I wondered, are there a small number of large land owners who are realizing profits on their land? How does that work?
From the sample of, well, the 40 properties that we identified, there was one owner who owns 13 of the properties, but the other properties were all owned by separate individuals. So there's a case of one person who owns, who has a large, important hold over that. In terms of this, but the actual percentage of renting to ownership is something that we've not been able to identify for the commercial properties.
And where they live, some of those landowners or property owners who have smaller or who appear to have smaller ownership?
No, but that's a good question, because I think would be this, because the common idea is that these people who invest in these high scale shops don't actually live in the neighbourhood, but we're not sure if that's actually the case or not.
Yeah, so I was just thinking in terms of the scales here, because as much as being an urban morphologist by background, I'm thinking that those diagrams at block scale. What sort of size of area are we dealing with, and what's the context with surrounding areas? Because I'm trying to figure out what sort of process this is. If it's a kind of process of expansion of a city centre almost into another district, or a kind of the standalone phenomenon.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the area that we're looking at is roughly 10 city blocks by 5 city blocks, and this area is connected to the inner city. It's next to the inner city. It's actually very near those enormous tall blocks that I showed you. So perhaps some of the people that live in those blocks are coming to the neighbourhood at the weekend to walk around it. Is it an extension of another commercial area? It doesn't seem to be. The main commercial area in Providencia is much further up, and so there seems to be more of an alternative. The artists that began to colonise the area, when we spoke with them, they talked about wanting to come to a place that had a vida del barrio, which is like a sort of neighbourhood life. It was quiet, it was out the way. At the same time, it's not very far from the metro, although it is kind of a backwater, considered a backwater, but it's actually very well connected.
So if it's like 50 odd city blocks with the population that you said it had to.
And yes, that was another point from the sample that we took. We took an area that was much smaller. We took the area which is, I'll show it here.
So that's what I was kind of struggling to.
Yes, sorry, yes. This area, the sample was taken from this area, which is much smaller. So that we're focusing on an area which had a very obvious change in terms of the use.
So that's the area that you 48 are in, and that had about 700.
Yes, yes, yes.
Your studies are interesting. It reminds me a little bit of what I'm doing a little bit, and what you're describing is very much similar, I think, to what happened in Chapala, Mexico, when the artists from the United States and other parts of the world started coming until it became crazy, right? So I was going to ask you that, like these artists that are arriving, are they nationals or are they from other countries? Or are they? I mean, that sounds to me like it could be something similar to this global phenomenon of this later life and retirement migration from other countries in the world. Like it sounds like it could be. Do you know? I mean, these artists, like who are the renters, the owners of these shops? So who are the drivers of this process of gentrification? Are they nationals or foreigners?
Yes, we don't have any real data on that. I would say that the majority would be Chilean, but many of them have come from outside and come back to with their ideas from abroad. That's very common. Some of the commercial clusters that I showed at the very beginning, people talk about having developments that are like Covent Garden in London or Les Halles in Paris, which is to do with sort of setting up this restaurant trade or restaurant areas. And so many of the art, I'm not sure if it's the artists here though, to be honest, if we were talking about trying to turn this area. I think it's other people that come after the artists who want to try and capitalise on the idea of this artistic neighbourhood. Yeah.
I just wondered whether there was any ever sort of resistance or contestation, either when the artists originally arrived or when the more corporate interests start to replace the artists.
Yes. One thing we have done in the neighbourhood is we have set up, with the university, we did set up some conversations with local residents. We invited local residents to come along and talk to us. And there was a feeling of they're aware of what's going on, but there's a difficulty in imagining how they might be able to sort of contest this. And we've been thinking about that. How can we get people involved to try and mitigate, maybe not the best word, but to try and avoid some of the proliferation of commercial properties here. So we've been thinking about that in terms of what we could do as planners or architects to try and talk to the local municipality and say, well, here, this is supposedly an area that of mixed use, and what it's going to turn into is basically retail. So what are your ideas on that, and how can we try and maybe think about having some percentage of retail within this area rather than all turning into residential retail, sorry, and losing all the residential. And yes, and the other idea was how can we get people interested and involved, and we have through these organised conversations with people, we were able to influence the group of furniture restorers to form the how would you call it, trade organisation perhaps. So they've now organised a trade organisation between themselves. They're all down along the street here, which is Can Street, and there's about maybe 30 different stores that have now organised themselves, not because of us, but indirectly, and they now have help from the local municipality in terms of organisation, and because of their organisation, they're now legally recognised and they can apply for funding from the Chilean government for the municipality for improvements or for for trying to improve their business.
So I was wondering if you could go back to that the maps that were from the 1930s. Because it looked like, obviously there's going to be a change in the retail that exists in the neighbourhood, but it looked like there was actually quite a, sorry, that one 40, sorry. It looked like there's actually a lot of retail in the initial one. So is it that there's a change in the amount of space that the retail is taking up, whereas maybe in a small shop you would have had a residential attached to it, and now it's just all shop? Yeah. Because it looks like in the 1940s, it looks like it was still a mixed use, but there was actually more then. So just wondering, is it also that there was decline that meant more, and was that empty or was that residential in the 1990s? Do you know?
You compare that with the population dropping. What these only show is they only show the new commercial licenses. They don't actually show the whole picture.
Oh.
So I suppose what I'm showing here is the amount. So we're talking about the amount of commercial space that is now in the neighbourhood. You're right. You're absolutely right. It's very comparable to what was there in the 1940s. But in the 1940s, we have a lot more people to the one building. So we have density. We have a residential density that's much higher than it is now. So in that case, the more residential we have today, the more the impact. But no, I think that is an interesting sort of question. We often limited, but the evidences that we're able to collect will give us a very specific piece of information, which is very difficult to try and find out exactly what was going on at that time.
Yeah. Who was what? So, no? Okay.
In trying to understand the transition, does there seem to be any evidence that actually the artists who were there before, almost as weird, say, kind of precursors, I suppose, to the gentrification, are they involved in some of that retail? Is some of that design retail actually kind of art, artists selling from their own kind of shop studio, or is this much more really a phenomenon that's quite different from the artists?
I think the artists were involved in the galleries that opened and sold the artists' work, but the design shops that are there at the moment sell things imported from Italy. So you can buy a lamp for £300. £300 in Chile is a lot of money. So it tends, I think the retail, yes, they've not benefited from this. They're not part of it from what we've seen.
I was wondering if the way to capture the broader process that you're describing here, so in terms of new residents and newer residents like artists or maybe professional, intellectual, and also the drop in population and the commercial spaces, including I guess there is a bit of a cafe culture.
There were some cafes, and the cafes are there more to service the people that are coming out of the retail shops, so the design shops.
And they are galleries. I wonder if maybe lifestyle gentrification would be another term to capture. And if you've looked into any which I'm interested to know more because I'm looking at which are lifestyle economies or lifestyle
that is something we've not looked at, but I think that is a very interesting way in which.
Because in part, I wonder if the fact that you haven't observed that any corporate presence yet may be in part due to the fact that there is an emotion of maintaining certain image around lifestyle may not benefit from corporate presence. in there.
Yes.
So it may not be just about the commercial aspect, it may be about rather cultural.
I think that's would be a very interesting compliment.
Sorry, you may
So
what you already answered.
comment really on the cultural contrast, if you like, in the use of the term gentrification. Your opening slide of the large blocks, which are what gentrified
Yes.
here, and I'm talking about sort of West Yorkshire, say, they would be prime material for knocking down as being really low class sort of thing. And whereas you would be looking for warehouse buildings to convert into flats and things like that, these are places down by the river and all that sort of thing. But sometimes you would get units like over in Halifax, Dean Club Mills, you may or may not be familiar with it, but it's a vast old carpet mill in the Victorian period, which was converted to small usages by artists, sort of tradespeople who were making sort of particularly sort of classy beer, that sort of thing, and they ended up employing more people in there than had ever been employed there as a mill. And you're just talking about values that sort of slightly surprised me in a way. You know, the first building of tower blocks, you see tower blocks around Leeds, they're the last places that you can sort of gentrify. So I'm wondering what the contrast is in here and here. Is there a lack of older buildings, basically? There's lots of them around here. But another contrast is where we're sitting in the university. 1940s, most of this was a residential area. It was flattened to build the university. Talk about gentrification. That's got some element of it in it. That is more like what we're talking about there. We're sitting amongst it. There were lots and lots of rows of terraced houses which would be inhabited by people sitting in the inner city suburb. And relatively little of it was the Parkinson building, very poor and everything. All the rest, including the area was sitting used to be terraced housing, back and being able to build the university for relatively well-off students. Russell Group. Sorry.
No, I'll try and answer that. I think, yes,
but it's the contrast.
It's the contrast.
It surprised me when you brought up that first slide. I thought you were going to say, oh, this sort of thing you knocked down.
Yeah.
That's
No, this is.
We have new build gentrification in Leeds as well.
Sorry?
We've got plenty of new build gentrification in Leeds.
Yeah, but it tends to be more sort of multi-layered, doesn't it? Not just
The first
straight
wave,
block.
the first wave of that in Leeds was colonialism, but the second wave of new build gentrification in Leeds is very much citizens of
No,
apartments.
it's
not
there's
high.
still an attempt at sort of rather pastiche external sort of layering buildings.
Have you been down to small Leeds?
Yeah, I know.
Horrible
Horrible
developments that
ones
we've
as well.
got around.
Yeah. I know you can undermine this
Yeah.
very easily.
You can have them around, City Island and so on.
But
They're not
those,
high,
yeah,
they're
those,
not high.
those are sort of
God, yeah.
most apparent on council estates.
Yeah.
I live on a council estate. I'm often outside of this scenario, and they're not in one of those.
It's just a bit odd because we've not built anything like that since the 1970s.
No, we haven't. There's not all.
But it's about land values. It's about how much you can realise out of the land. Yeah. Whereas if you're going into the historic areas, I'm trying to kind of make connections between places. I'm thinking a little bit of the jewellery quarter in Birmingham, which is kind of undergoing this. A lot of buildings which have a house typology, but very similar to house typology. They're actually jewellery studios. There's a lot of pressure there's a lot of residential pressure because it's the edge of city centre Birmingham. So the kind of people who live in city centre flats, they want to live in jewellery fields because it's not high rise. And the old big factories being turned into flats, but there's a lot of pressure on all these smaller buildings. And I do sense the kind of a bit of an instability that wasn't there when I was an undergrad walking around there doing stuff. Where you just have this pressure because there's all these historic buildings and there's really high land value. What can you do? And yeah, I've got a feeling that a lot of the jewellery trade there, the individual jewellery traders are going to get priced out.
You'll find something like this in Singapore or Hong Kong or many Chinese cities, and maybe there's quite a lot of parallels to draw in that direction. Maybe, let's tourism.
Yes.
Although, of course, I mean, if you look at some of the high-rise blocks that are being done up now, done up to students, or indeed have been done up by property companies and the rent or for sale. So what comes around goes around.
It's quite pretty extreme then. It's clear.
Aren't aesthetics of these buildings, they have cultural context in them. So us looking from these, it doesn't mean it doesn't have a different meaning. And what counts as modern as well. For example, in contested cities, when we stayed in Santiago, we stayed in a tower block that looked pretty like that.
Yeah.
And on the roof was an absolutely amazing swimming pool with views of the surrounding mountains and the rest of the city, and it was obviously an extremely luxury development, so I think it's quite hard to make those.
I think also that that's very true actually, because to me I think there's a very difficult relationship with their built heritage. Many of the buildings are Spanish colonial style, which was very much rejected by the Chileans. And then also in the area of earthquake, many of these older buildings are unjustifiably but often seen as being dangerous. So these new high-rise buildings which survive earthquakes, they're gated communities, they have a concierge, so they're very safe in the city centre, are often very attractive to people. And also, I think the people that are involved in the production of these buildings, more perhaps than the people that live in them, are responsible for this gentrification. And there's quite a lot of work by Ernesto Lopez that explains and tries to, does identify the ways in which this process is very much related to new build gentrification.
I think I've kind of just got the parallel here because it is, a lot of the industrial buildings probably look like that one from there.
Yeah.
But we find, a lot of big, for example, Georgian buildings. We find a lot of the edge of city centres actually becoming offices with often retail on the ground floor. It's actually quite, when you start looking around it, it's actually really quite common. And in Leeds, Park Square, which was built as a residential square, did actually lose residential completely and become entirely office and some small retail. But now residential's moved back, and it is often about sort of who's willing to pay the most for the space in historic buildings which aren't going to get knocked down. And I just wonder on the back of that whether it's something that isn't necessarily a complete out-and-out gentrification process, but is just a consequence of that's the situation at that time, and another time when the retail space isn't going to be as valuable or isn't going to generate those kind of profit yields that it might change again.
That said, it's worth noting that the majority of the buildings there were many more of them.
So,
Yeah, that's sort of the-
So you mentioned in your introduction you provided like a contrast between the two areas, and then Italia Facultad was kind of a piecemeal process of gentrification. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the role of the state, you think, in the commercial gentrification of the area, because two things struck me. One, the changing like street architecture for the furniture restorers, were the state responsible for that? And then also when you had the interesting slide about the planning regulations, the planning regulations for Italia Capolatana like topped out quite low compared to other areas, for example, where they're built. So I wonder if that was part of, you know, some sort of metropolitan state body's plan to maybe turn this into a touristy area or a boutique commercial area, and therefore keep the buildings quite low.
What's from, yes, so what way is the state involved in this? I think it's very true that the restriction on the heights has been very fundamental there. We did speak to the urban what's this sort of, it was like a sort of well, the person that advises the council on urban planning, and he said that they had in 2007, I think, restricted the height in that area because they saw that there was a lot of historic buildings that they wanted to try and preserve in some way. Whether they had a further plan related to that, I'm not exactly sure. And maybe it's important to say as well that this neighbourhood is on the edge of a rich neighbourhood. So it's a neighbourhood that's not had very much attention paid to it until quite recently. So by the municipality did put in this, did make an intervention in the public space. They've also built a swimming pool, and they've also built a centre for social development. So the municipality was looking to try and improve the area for the people that live there. So whether, I'm not sure whether they did actually have an idea behind the promotion of the area as a sort of a retail cluster, retail destination. But saying that, the land use regulations are very permissive, so that it's very easy for that to happen. So that's a standard land use designation that we use all over the municipality. So even if they didn't think that retail would take off in this area, and there was certainly opportunity for that from planning guidelines that are very permissive, I suppose you could say. I think the municipality began to become more interested when they saw that this was going to turn into some kind of business for them. Although saying that now, the municipality is very interested in looking to see how they can try to help furniture restorers in this sort of trade exploitation, where they can try and help them out there.
I have some questions.
This is a different local authority to this we're talking about. Right?
Yes.
Those are our different local authorities.
There, Santiago, I suppose, is you'd imagine like London. It's got lots of different municipalities, and there's no, although unlike London, it has no overall city government.
Okay, I had really lots of questions, but one was I agree with Paul that the kind of methodological work you've done is really interesting, and you haven't fully sold it enough to us. Maybe I wanted to know more about. Is it something you just learned by doing? You had a plan? Because I can see that you've done different publications and you've got different methods for each of them. So, because I haven't really seen these in detail, this kind of work. Maybe it comes more from an architectural background that you've got, because certainly in gentrification,
literature in geography, urban studies. I haven't really seen this. So, yeah, did you learn it from somewhere? You had it already in mind? Did you have a plan? Did it just develop along the way? Or?
I think to describe the process that we were involved in 2009, we went on to a neighbourhood meeting and people were shouting and beginning to talk about the changes in the neighbourhood. And we were also invited by an artists guild, I suppose you'd call it, an organisation of artists to come along and see what was happening. So we started to study the area in terms of its morphology and in terms of the processes that were involved in the area. So we did drawings of buildings and we reconstructed the history of buildings because we started to think about gentrification and ways in which gentrification takes or can take or inform the physical form of an area. So we started to look very small scale. And I suppose maybe that comes from architecture. We deal with buildings and then we think about the street that sort of goes from a point and then goes outwards. So so we developed our understanding this through the physical environment, through individual things, and it seemed to be the more we read about it, the more we could understand exactly how this began to fit into these larger processes. So the architecture became much less of the driver of our study, not less important, but became an element, one of many elements which were to do with many other things, the state, the individuals. Yeah. So there's, I would say, yes, I would say that the presentation here is a sort of presentation of work that's been developed for a number of years. So we have a number of different things that we sort of, sources that we can pull from.
I had another question. If you could just maybe give us in more detail, how does this actually happen, this change of use? So is there a house that is kind of abandoned, people leave, and then like somebody buys that or rents it, or how does it actually happen that people are displaced? I don't understand how the change of use happens.
Right.
Yes.
Something we've not been able to quantify or to try and get an idea of the numbers, but what seems to have happened in the places that we've been able to observe ourselves, that there was in 2009 people living there, and for some reason it's turned into a commercial use. Of what we've heard is happening is that developers are knocking on people's doors and saying, "I'll buy your house. How much do you want for it?" The people sell their house and then they leave the neighbourhood. So in that sense, it's not direct displacement. It's very yeah. But the people, yes, that seems to be what's happening.
So it looks like you could complement the methodology with some case studies of certain like interviews with people. I don't know. Are you doing that as well?
We have done some interviews, but actually the specific. It's quite difficult to get hold of the people that have gone.
So neighbours.
So, although we have some evidence from some interviews with people who sold their house and moved on, or some people who have left their house and are living somewhere else and rent out their property to people to use as retail space.
Well, thank you so much. I think that was really useful, very much, very in-depth detail. Hopefully that was useful for you as well. Okay. Cheers.
So, are you intending to go back and look at the